The wind rolled slowly across the dry valley as Daniel Carter guided his dusty truck down the narrow dirt road. The land stretched endlessly around him, miles of brown grass, scattered pines, and distant blue mountains. The farm he had just bought was supposed to be abandoned. Cheap land, the agent had said. No neighbors for miles. Perfect for a man who wanted silence. Daniel had wanted silence for years. The truck finally rattled to a stop in front of the farmhouse. The building stood tall but worn, its wooden walls faded by decades of sun and winter storms. A broken fence leaned along the road. The barn door creaked gently in the wind. Daniel stepped out of the truck and stretched his stiff back. The air smelled like dry soil and old timber. For the first time in a long while, the quiet felt peaceful. He grabbed his bag from the truck and walked toward the house. The wooden steps groaned beneath his boots as he climbed to the porch. The door looked old, but solid. Daniel reached for the handle. Before he could turn it, the door opened. He froze. Standing inside the doorway were three women. All of them were tall, much taller than he expected. Strong shoulders, thick arms, the kind of strength that came from years of hard work. Their clothes were simple farm clothes, jeans, boots, flannel shirts, but their eyes studied him like strangers measuring a threat. Daniel blinked. "I think there's been a mistake." The tallest woman crossed her arms. Her dark hair was tied in a long braid over her shoulder. "You the man who bought this place?" she asked. Her voice was calm but firm. Daniel nodded slowly. "Daniel Carter." The woman glanced back at the other two. One was blonde with sharp gray eyes. The other had curly black hair and a quiet expression. The blonde woman leaned against the doorframe. "Then I guess the land agent didn't tell you." "Tell me what?" Daniel asked. "That we already live here." The wind pushed across the porch again, rattling loose boards on the barn. Daniel rubbed his neck. "The contract said the property was empty." The tall woman shrugged. "Contracts say a lot of things." Daniel studied them carefully. None of them looked nervous. None of them looked like squatters afraid of being kicked out. They looked like people who had been living here a long time. "How long?" he asked. 3 years, the quiet woman answered softly. Daniel let out a slow breath. 3 years. He looked past them into the house. The interior lights were on. A wood stove crackled gently in the corner. There were boots by the wall, a kettle steaming in the kitchen. This wasn't temporary. This was home. The tall woman stepped aside slightly. "You can come in if you want." Daniel hesitated for a moment before stepping through the doorway. The house smelled warm, wood smoke and coffee. He set his bag down near the wall. "I'm guessing none of you are planning to leave." The blonde woman shook her head. "No." Daniel rubbed his jaw. "Well, that complicates things." The quiet woman poured coffee into a mug and handed it to him. "Cold outside." Daniel accepted it cautiously. "Thanks." For a moment, no one spoke. The wind tapped lightly against the windows. Finally, Daniel asked, "So, what exactly is the arrangement here?" The tall woman sat at the table. "We take care of the land, the animals, the crops." "You have animals?" Daniel asked. "Some goats, chickens, 2 horses." Daniel looked surprised. The agent had never mentioned livestock. "Where did they come from?" The blonde woman smiled faintly. "We brought them." Daniel took a sip of the coffee. It was strong, but good. "So you just decided to live here?" "Not exactly," the quiet woman said. Daniel waited, but she didn't continue. The tall woman leaned forward on the table. "Look, Mr. Carter, you bought the land, that's fair. But we built this place back up when nobody else cared. The roof used to leak. The barn was half collapsed. The well pump didn't work." Daniel glanced toward the window where the barn stood solid in the fading light. "You fixed all that?" "Yes." Daniel exhaled slowly. The situation was becoming stranger by the minute. He had expected an empty farm and quiet solitude. Instead, he had walked into a fully running homestead with 3 women who clearly weren't planning to move. All right, Daniel said finally. Let's slow down and figure this out. The blonde woman tilted her head. You're not throwing us out? Daniel shook his head. Not tonight. The quiet woman seemed relieved. Outside, the sky darkened as clouds rolled across the mountains. The temperature dropped quickly. A storm was coming. Daniel stood and walked toward the window. In the distance, he could see dark snow clouds gathering over the ridge. How bad do winters get here? He asked. The tall woman joined him at the window. Bad, she said. Blizzards sometimes last 3 days. Daniel nodded thoughtfully. He had survived worse places during his years working construction across the north. But something about this place felt different. Not dangerous exactly, just strange. Behind him, the quiet woman added another log to the fire. The room filled with a soft glow of flames. Daniel turned back to the women. So, he said, if we're all staying here tonight, I guess introductions are in order. The tall woman nodded. I'm Marta, she pointed to the blonde. That's Claire. Then to the quiet woman. And that's Elena. Daniel gave a small nod. Well, looks like we're housemates for now. Claire smirked slightly. For now. The wind outside began to howl louder, pushing snow against the windows. The storm had arrived faster than expected. Daniel stared into the swirling darkness outside the glass. Something about the way the three women watched the storm made him uneasy, almost like they had been waiting for it. He turned back slowly. Marta's eyes met his across the room. Good thing you showed up today, she said quietly. Daniel frowned. Why? Marta looked toward the window where snow was now falling in thick white sheets. Because, she said calmly, once this storm hits, nobody leaves this farm for days. And Daniel Carter suddenly realized he might not understand this place, or the three women living in it, nearly as well as he thought. The wind outside slammed hard against the wooden walls of the farmhouse, making the entire structure groan like an old ship fighting a storm at sea. Snow whipped past the windows in violent white spirals, swallowing the road Daniel had just driven down less than an hour ago. Within minutes, the valley disappeared beneath a curtain of ice and wind. Daniel stood still near the window, watching the storm swallow the land. Marta didn't move beside him. Her expression remained calm, almost familiar with the chaos outside. Claire leaned back in her chair with her boots resting on another chair, while Elena quietly stirred a pot on the stove. No one seemed surprised by the blizzard. Storms come fast here, Marta said quietly. Daniel nodded slowly. Yeah, I can see that. He glanced back at the room again, studying the three women more carefully. Something about them didn't match the typical image of people stranded on someone else's land. They were too organized, too comfortable. This place ran like a machine. So, Daniel finally said, you've been living here 3 years? Marta nodded. 3 winters. Claire smirked slightly. And every one worse than the last. Daniel looked toward the barn through the stormy window. And you managed to keep animals alive through all that? Elena answered softly without turning around. You learn quickly when winter tries to kill you. Her words hung quietly in the air. Daniel took another sip of his coffee. Still doesn't explain something. Claire raised an eyebrow. What's that? Daniel set the mug down. Why 3 women would choose to live alone on an isolated farm miles from the nearest town? For the first time, the room went completely silent. The fire crackled. Wind screamed outside. Marta looked at Claire. Claire looked at Elena. Finally, Marta spoke. We didn't choose it. Daniel waited. Marta continued slowly. 3 years ago, this farm belonged to a man named Harold Whitaker. Daniel frowned slightly. The previous owner? Yes, Marta said, but Harold died during the second winter. Daniel leaned against the table. What happened? Claire let out a small, dry laugh. Blizzard. Elena quietly added another log to the fire. Marta continued the story. He lived here alone for decades. When the storm hit, he got trapped in the barn trying to save the horses. Roof collapsed. Daniel crossed his arms. That's rough. Marta nodded. The bank took the property after that, but no one came out here. Too far, too cold, too forgotten. Claire shrugged. So we stayed. Daniel tilted his head. You work for him? Elena finally turned from the stove. We were travelers. Daniel didn't fully believe that answer, but he didn't push further. Instead, he walked slowly toward the front door and opened it a few inches. The wind instantly blasted snow into the hallway. The cold bit his face like knives. Daniel shut the door quickly. Yeah, he muttered. No one's leaving tonight. Claire chuckled. Told you. Hours passed slowly as the storm grew stronger. Dinner was simple, bread, beans, and roasted potatoes, but warm. Daniel helped carry water buckets and stack firewood beside the stove. The strange tension from earlier slowly softened into something calmer. Still, there were moments Daniel caught the women exchanging quiet glances he didn't understand. Later that night, Daniel stepped onto the porch briefly to check the truck. The storm had buried half the tires already. When he came back inside, Elena was standing near the door. You shouldn't go outside much during storms like this, she said gently. Daniel brushed snow from his coat. Why? Elena hesitated. Marta answered from across the room. Because people disappear in these storms. Daniel raised an eyebrow. Disappear? Claire leaned forward slightly, her tone half serious. Snow covers everything. Roads vanish. Footprints vanish. Sometimes people vanish too. Daniel gave a small, uneasy laugh. Comforting. Marta didn't laugh. Just truth. Midnight came quietly. The storm raged like a monster outside the farmhouse. Daniel finally settled into an old couch near the fire. Marta and Claire took the 2 bedrooms upstairs. Elena slept in a small room beside the kitchen. The house slowly went dark. But sometime in the middle of the night, Daniel woke suddenly. At first, he didn't know why. Then he heard it. A noise outside. Not wind, something else. A heavy thud, then another. Daniel sat up slowly. The fire had burned low, leaving only faint orange embers. The room was dim and silent. Another thud came from outside near the barn. Daniel quietly stood and moved toward the window. Snow still fell heavily, but through the swirling white, he could barely make out a shape moving near the barn door. His heartbeat slowed. Someone was out there. Or something. Behind him, a quiet voice suddenly spoke. You heard it too. Daniel turned quickly. Elena stood behind him in the darkness. What is it? He whispered. Elena stared toward the barn through the storm. Her expression had changed completely. Gone was the calm, quiet woman from earlier. Now her eyes were sharp, alert. Trouble, she said quietly. At that moment, the barn door outside slammed open violently in the wind, and Daniel realized the storm might not be the most dangerous thing on this farm.